One. So as we approach getting our bees through the winter, I want to lay a foundation of the goals that we want to accomplish in this class. First, we need to learn the activities of the winter cluster and how bees act in nature to survive the winter, meaning their natural habitat. And we like to also learn how individual bees build up reservoirs of protein in their fat bodies to help overwinter. That's really important. We'll talk about that. Also, we'll talk about the proper fall inspection, how to assess your hive in the fall, and what kind of changes you need to be making in the fall to prepare your bees for winter. Now, that means that you're preparing all year long for your bees to overwinter. But that last inspection, there'll be a few things that'll be crucial that you'll need to do if they're not ready. You'll need to perform some tasks. For example, if they're queenless or they have a failing queen, and upon your last inspection, by all means, you got to put another queen in there. And we'll talk more about that. Another goal is we want to learn the various feeding options in the fall. We want to feed bees in the fall, in the winter, and in early spring, and that will maximize the survival of the colony. Failure to feed your bees protein and sugar, honey, carbohydrate, failure to do that in the fall, in the winter, and in early spring will result in either the colony failing or the colony being very weak coming out of winter and never making up for lost ground. We'll talk about that. Another goal is to understand why most colonies perish in the winter, to understand mites and viruses and the steps that we can take in order to reduce mites. Another goal is we're going to discuss various methods on how to wrap hives and whether or not that's effective. We're going to talk about windbreaks and other things that we can do in the winter and whether they're worth their weight in gold or not. Heating lamps, greenhouses, we'll talk about all of that a little bit to see if that's really worthwhile. And finally, we want to review many tips and tricks that can help bees survive the winter. Just a hodgepodge of ideas, and I'll give a commentary on if those are effective or not. So those are the class goals. So as you can see in the image here, this is one of my colonies. I'm not sure what year that was. It's probably about 10 years ago. You can see there's snow on the ground around the hive, and I actually opened up, maybe, I can't tell if that's two deeps that I've split to take a peek, or maybe that's a top super, maybe I overwintered with a honey super, but nonetheless, you can see the cluster. This is what bees do in the wintertime. They cluster. That means they don't keep the inside of their hive warm like we do our homes. In our houses, it can be 72 degrees all the way in the far corner and 72 right where we're sitting around a supper table. Bees don't do that. Bees only stay warm in direct proximity to one another. And so sometimes the temperature next to the wall of the hive is the same temperature as outside of the hive because the heat is only generated by the cluster in close proximity to one another. So they don't really heat their hive like we do our homes. And that's a mistake a lot of beekeepers make. Some beekeepers overwrap their hives, seal them off like we want to do our homes, and that makes problems for the hive. And we'll talk about that. You want to have ventilation. You want to have the ability for the bees to move around in their winter cluster. So we have to understand this winter cluster. When the outside temperature drops to about 50 and below degrees Fahrenheit, 50 or below Fahrenheit, the bees will begin to cluster. They'll stay close together to keep each other warm. And especially if there's brood in the colony, they have to keep that brood 92.5 if it is pupating like cat brood. So they have to work extra hard to keep the colony very warm in the wintertime. So always think of that. 50 degrees or lower, the bees are forming a tight cluster. Bees do not hibernate like a bear does. Bees stay alive, they stay active, but they stay kind of calm and all in one big ball, a big cluster, and they vibrate their thoracic muscles so that they can generate heat in order to stay warm, and they can generate a lot of heat. As you see in this image, you can see how the colony performs in nature, like in a tree. Typical example of how bees function in nature: they find a hollow hole in a decaying tree and they build comb in that tree. They have a small entrance, they go in there, they take over, and you can see how they keep empty comb toward the bottom usually, and they have the brood closest to the door, and they store their pollen a little bit above the brood and their honey at the very top of the colony in the tree. Now this is for protection. If robbing insects want to steal the honey, they have to go through all the bees, all the brood, in order to get up to the top of the honey. That's why we do Langstroth hives the way that we do. Typically we have the brood at the bottom 2 deeps, and then we have our honey supers on top of those, and that cuts down on the other insects, bees, being able to fly in and rob a colony because they have to go through the brood nest area to get to the honey. So you can see this is how bees prepare to overwinter in late summer in their natural habitat, a tree. Now, if you look what happens in the winter, you can see that the cluster begins moving up for 2 reasons. It moves up because heat rises. And so as the bees produce heat in order to keep the brood area warm, to keep the cluster warm, heat from the cluster rises above the cluster. And that will rise up into the heat, rises up into the stored honey on top, and then the bees move up into that honey. Now, bees don't keep honey that's stored above them 92.5 degrees. They'll keep it warm. Sometimes they may not even bother with keeping it warm, but typically it may stay 70, 80 degrees. But as they move up into it, if it is cold or frozen, they'll simply warm it up as a byproduct of them being up in it, generating heat, and then they can consume it. So this is what bees do. You can see the empty comb gets larger toward the bottom. There's more empty comb. Bees are deserting it and moving up into the pollen and into the honey. And that's how bees go through the winter in nature. So that's what we want to mimic in our colonies. Now, in preparation of this class, I did a lot of research looking at a lot of literature, scientific literature that people have written, and scientific studies that people have performed about overwintering bees. And it was very interesting doing that study, and you'll be thankful that I did all that research so that you don't have to. And I can just kind of give you the brief overview of what I found out in all my studies. One of the studies that I really liked was a study by Charles Owens, and he did a study in the early 70s in Madison, Wisconsin, and those of you in the north know that it gets pretty cold there. And from December the 1st until March the 31st, he conducted his research over a 5-year period. And I want to quote some of the work that he did, because I found this to be one of the most interesting observations that he made. He said that on January the 4th, between 7 and midnight, when the outside temperature was between 2 and 9 degrees Fahrenheit, the cluster moved sideways and down into the center body. And if I recall his study, I believe he went on to say that the cluster moved down, again, it's only between 2 and 9 degrees Fahrenheit. The cluster moved down into a lower deep, gathered up the honey, and then moved back to their clustered position up higher. And I thought that was really interesting. And from this study, from the research that he did with all the, I guess the information that he could get from the instruments that he had at the time, he had a lot of temperature sensors and all. He found that if colonies were below 40,000 in population, they were at risk of not surviving the winter. And I gathered and concluded from his research that bees need to have at least 40,000 or more bees in their colony in order to survive the winter. Well, let's talk about why bees die in the wintertime. Many bees die in the winter from starvation in the winter cluster. If the colony runs out of food around the brood area, they cannot leave that brood area. They have to stay there to keep it warm. And so oftentimes you'll find that a colony in the north on a very cold spell will cluster tight. And by the way, the colder that it gets, the tighter the cluster gets. So once it gets above 50, they break cluster and go about their roaming around the hive. 50 degrees, they're kind of a big cluster because they don't need to get real tight. But as it gets colder and colder, the cluster gets smaller and smaller. And remember, frames are running between the cluster. The cluster is, a lot of the bees are going into cells so that they can transfer the heat between comb and frames, but it's still a big ball taking up a lot of frame spaces inside that colony like we saw in the picture. So when it gets colder, the cluster gets tighter in order to stay warmer. Now they have to do that over the brood area where maybe the queen might still be laying a little bit in the wintertime. And so you can imagine if it gets cold, let's say it gets down to 20 degrees and it's a tight cluster, and they're starting to eat all the food in this area right here, and then the next day the high temperature may only be 10 degrees. You know how sometimes it gets colder the next day than it was at the night. And it's 10 degrees, so the cluster is smaller. They're getting further away from the honey that was available to them because they're tightening their cluster. So now they're further away from the honey. You know, honey's out here, or honey is everywhere, but as they eat, they're getting smaller and smaller. That night it may get down to 5 degrees. They get tighter and tighter. They've eaten all the honey that will support them because of this cold snap. So if it stays that way for an extended period of time, a colony that's below 40,000 in number doesn't have the size in order to reach or encompass the honey that makes up the frames throughout the colony. And that's why my technique is to keep your colony very, very strong in the fall and in the winter. Let it become very large in the fall, very large going into winter, very large all winter, so that the cluster is very big. 50 to 60,000 bee, a huge cluster. So even if it gets 5 degrees, they tighten, but the space that they tighten up still encompasses a lot of honey to the side of them and above them. And as Charles Owens mentioned, they can even move about because they're so big. They can keep some bees on the brood to keep it warm, and then the other bees can stretch out the cluster and gather up honey from different places. A lot of people don't understand this. We're stuck really in an old paradigm of beekeeping where a lot of people just can't understand what I'm talking about. And once look, I'm explaining it to you. It's very simple. I did a lot of research myself. I had some expensive instruments in the colony years ago where I measured temperature and humidity and watched what was going on in the hive. And it's amazing how simple this process is, just observing what bees do in nature and then letting it happen and supporting it in our own colonies. The mistake that a lot of beekeepers will make is they'll go to feed their bees some sugar in the fall, maybe 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. Well, most people do 2-to-1 in the fall. And that is not a correct way to do it. You will hear that. Remember, students, 2-to-1 sugar water in the fall is only to build up the colony. So 2-to-1 is more syrupy, so they can take that real syrupy sugar and store it in the frames. They don't have to dry it as long to cap it over. 1-to-1 sugar water in the fall, however, supports brood buildup if you assist the colony with pollen. And we'll talk more about this. So I believe it's an incorrect and old paradigm just to throw 2-to-1 on your colonies in the fall. Many studies as of late have shown that if you're just feeding sugar to bees, it is detrimental. They have to have pollen. They're just like humans. We have to have protein, which is pollen. We have to have carbohydrates for the bees, it's nectar and honey. So it's important to realize we need protein, and the bees need protein. We need protein in that hive all winter long. So as we're feeding those bees, they're able to continue to raise more bees by having the protein to fuel the nurse bees to feed the developing larvae. That's really crucial. So along these lines, we have vitellogenesis, which is kind of a scientific way of describing how honeybees take vitellogenin molecules and deposit these in their fat bodies located in their head and their abdomen. These aren't fat bodies like we were mentioning, I'm talking about humans rather. These are actually reservoirs where bees can actually store protein. Young bees can actually store these vital proteins in their own reservoirs in their body. Older bees, such as foragers, really don't have this capability. They don't need it. That's why they don't have it. Foragers live a short life. They die at day 42 after they're born. And so they really don't need to be storing proteins in their body. They just fly out, gather nectar, and die after a couple of weeks of foraging. And so with overwintered bees of winter physiology, very young bees that you're going to raise in the months of September, October, and November, these are going to be young bees that have never foraged. They won't forage because they're raised after a hard freeze, for example, and all the vegetation is frozen. So these bees will not forage. That means that they are of winter physiology. They're not worn out like a foraging bee would be. Now let me say this before I forget or fail to mention it in the future. A lot of you make the tragic mistake of looking at your colony in the fall and you go, wow, it's full of bees, it's made a lot of honey. Look at all those bees. So many bees. Well, what age are those bees? And what is the physiology of those bees? Summer bees. How long do summer bees live? 42 days if you're lucky. So all the bees that you're seeing in August and September, they only live 42 days. So you can go into fall and you can say to yourself, wow, this is great. I got all these bees. I'm going to have a great hive, make it through the winter because my populations are 40,000 like David wants. No, they're not. Those bees are going to be gone. And sometimes beekeepers have failing or very inadequate queen in fall. Sometimes beekeepers kill their own queen harvesting their honey in the fall. Or the queen is just out of sperm in her spermatheca, or she's running low, she can't really lay well, she's not laying well. Or if you fail to feed your bees in the fall protein, not 2 to 1 sugar water, but if you fail to feed your colony protein in the fall, the nurse bees cannot support what the queen wants to lay. And so a lot of times beekeepers feed 2 to 1 sugar water. There's no protein available as a natural pollen source in the fall. That's not available. And bees don't have a way to feed themselves to produce royal jelly. Bees have to consume protein, young nurse bees, in order to generate royal jelly in order to feed the developing larvae of those winter physiology bees. So you can see the dilemma that we're in. If you fail to feed your bees protein in the fall and in the winter, you can't support the brood the numbers that you need to have to make the heat. It's all about having honey and pollen to make bees so that bees can make the heat to get through the winter. And all those bees have to be at minimal viral exposure as possible. These bees have to be exposed to the least amount of viruses transmitted by the viral destructor. And I'm going to say that over and over because this is the heart of what I'm trying to teach. This is a new paradigm. I assure you that once you understand it, it will click. So many people that follow my plan. I've got a mentorship program, a coaching program called Team 6. And I coach people all around the United States and I get their feedback. I get data from them. I'm overwhelmed by the success of people taking my winter bee kind winter feeding system and feeding those bees protein all winter long, watching those numbers get really, really strong all winter, and then coming into spring with a colony that is just huge. a very strong population, very strong laying queen, and a lot of brood that you can split your hive and make more hives. So these things are really exciting. So it all boils down to the bees having a lot of stored protein in these winter physiology bees that we raise by mass numbers that we raise in the fall. So when a new bee emerges, a newly emerging bee, she is very hungry and she begins to head to the honey that's in the comb for energy. And then that new bee begins to bulk up on protein that she'll find either in bee bread or in pollen. And she'll store that pollen to give her the strength and energy along with some of the honey to do the task that is ahead of her. Nurse bees feed the hive for about 6 to 7 days. So between the days age of nurse bee, between the age of 6 and 12 days old, those nurse bees are generating a lot of royal jelly. And so if you think of royal jelly, just behind the eyes, there's this ropey gland that has what is probably best described as grapes on it. So as the nurse bee begins to get old enough and mature enough on around day 6, these grapes within her mandibular gland actually becomes very swollen with royal jelly. And so she's able to express out this royal jelly and feed it to young developing larvae. All larvae between the age of 1 to 3 days is receiving royal jelly from these nurse bees. But once the nurse bee gets to about 12 days old, she's not able to produce the amount of royal jelly that she could. And in fact, if you look under a microscope past day 12 and on, this gland, actually the ropey gland itself, will look more like, instead of having grapes on it, it has dried up raisins on it. So this nurse bee doesn't need to do that anymore. She's advancing in age so that she can actually do other things such as forage and make wax and things like that. However, during the winter physiology, the age of the bee being 6 to 12 days old to produce royal jelly, due to the winter physiology, that is extended a bit. So she's able to take care of more developing larvae longer because she's not having to get geared up to go out and forage and do the natural age progression. That natural age progression, that the charts that you've seen, posters and all, that's not the same in the wintertime. That's usually based on summer activity, where it shows all the things that bees do until they die on day 42. Well, that's extended out as you take a look at bees of winter physiology. So these nurse bees have to have a lot of protein in order to plump up those grapes to actually secrete royal jelly to feed developing larvae. I am so excited about a lot of new studies that are being done showing that if bees in the developmental stage, the larva stage, if they're not fed an adequate amount of royal jelly, then those bees have a lot of issues. They don't forage well, they're disoriented, they only live half their life. So it's important that beekeepers realize you've got to keep protein in that colony. So many colonies, and beekeepers are just clueless. So many colonies have problems because of a lack of protein. And I want to stress that. Lack of protein causes a lot of issues in colonies, both in the winter time, but also in spring and summer and fall. You've got to have protein.